The moment you've all been dreading. It is time for me to talk about magic at length. Sorcery in Elden Ring is substantially stronger than Dark Souls 3, even from the beginning of the game. Your ability to deal high damage at a distance is an immediate advantage you have over every other class. Now, using the principles of sorcery and magicianship that we have all studied from prior From Software titles, it is shockingly simple to put together a successful invader. Better yet, now that spell slots are not arbitrarily tied to a stat, we can attune a variety of spells to cover every situation a magician may encounter. I shall begin with the disclaimer that 1. I am not a professional, and 2. The game has been out for like 2 weeks, so anything and everything I state here is not only bound to change, but be wrong on some level or another as we learn more about the game. Something else to consider while invading in the lands between is that, yes, the PvP of the game is indeed quite broken and janky, and there will be some situations so insurmountable that all you can do is pray for a one-shot, or Bloodhound step away and hope for the best. So, without further ado, let us inspect the foundation of our procedure: stats, staves, and weapons. Vigor, mind, and intelligence are the primary stats you will need, with mind being more of an afterthought based on preference rather than a necessity. At mid-level, 40-70 rune level-ish, you might hardly invest in this at all to get health and damage, and since you don't need to level it for spell slots, it might be best that you don't. I know I'll put a few points in here and there, but it's a matter of choice. My rune level 50 sorcerer has 35 vigor, 20 mind, and 40 intelligence with all the stat boosting gear I've equipped, and this, to me, seems like a healthy spread. At 120, the numbers get a bit more wild, but I've chosen to closely emulate my Dark Souls 3 build in ratio with a measly 45 vigor, 40 mind, and 77 intelligence after stat boosts. This is a build I will probably take up to 125, as well as respec it into something less flimsy by taking a few points out of mind and intelligence to put into vigor. Always aim to have 60 vigor. I have base stats otherwise, which gives me a small but reliable pool of weapons to draw from, including some straight swords, daggers, and rapiers, all of which complement sorceries well. As for staves, until you can reach a level that comfortably has 48 intelligence, the best staff by a decent margin is the meteorite staff, which doesn't even need to be upgraded. If you wish to have the boosting effects for specific spells that are inherent to other staves, like how the Carrion Glintstone staff boosts Carrion Sword sorcery, you can hold an unupgraded version of that staff in one hand, and then cast something like Carrion Slicer with the Meteorite Staff in the other, to take advantage of the Meteorite Staff's high spell scaling as well as the spell type boost from the Carrion Glintstone. This also applies to the boost in cast speed present in Azur's Glintstone Staff, which you do not even need to meet the requirements to benefit from. However, even 1.2 times the cost can be a bit costly at mid-level. I would not advise using the Luzat's staff to boost your damage, as the 1.5 times cost is extremely high at mid-level. Once you can use Luzat's at 52 intelligence, that staff becomes the best in terms of damage with its cost trade-off. This is definitely, probably, maybe, one of the better options in both a duel and invasion scenario, where you really need to get some bang for your buck. A more balanced choice that does not increase the cost of your spells is the Carrion Regal Scepter, which has slightly higher scaling than the Azur Staff, which means that you can boost the cast speed of the Carrion Regal Scepter with the Azur if you choose. For more extended engagements, the Carrion Regal Scepter is definitely a better choice, so it might be best to have all three on hand, upgrading at least the Carrion Regal and Luzat staves. I believe it is best to hot swap or hard swap between them as needed, Luzat's staff for extreme burst damage, Carrion Regal for space control and pressure, and also some pretty high-end burst damage of its own. As for your Flask of Wondrous Physic, make sure you choose something to complement your game plan. For me, that's enhancing my burst damage. I would recommend choosing the Magic Shrouding Cracked tier, mixed with the Intelligent Not Crystal tier for a hefty damage boost. You can also do what I have done and use the Ash of War Royal Knight's Resolve, or just Determination, on any weapon to further boost spell damage while the buff is active. Bear in mind that this is probably a glitch and will hopefully be patched, because the damage you can do with it is not the most disgusting thing in the game, but it is a lot. Now that we have our foundation, let us go over the tools of the trade. I'm going to go over a selection of spells that have jumped out at me as being notable for better, or for worse, and what they do for you in the invasion setting. The first of the Magician Essentials is Swift Glintstone Shard. It is the bread and butter of a sorcerer with surprisingly high damage for the speed and cost. It's really hard to react to and dodge. It can be strafed because the tracking is a bit poor, but there's hardly a bad time to throw one of these out. A fantastic poke and finisher. Carrion Slicer is another essential spell. It's Farron Flash Sword on Crack, Cocaine, and McDonald's Sprite. This thing does damage as opposed to just damage. It cleaves through shields and hits harder than most greatswords. If anyone gets anywhere near you, whip this out, and if they don't die after a few slashes, they're probably one swift Glintstone Shard away from death. Great Glintstone Shard is a staple of mage play, definitely a spell I like to have around, as it is the equivalent to Great Soul Arrow from Dark Souls 3. Surprisingly high damage, and easily dodged from neutral, but not easily dodged mid-animation or when cast on the unaware. A strong poking tool in tandem with Swift Glintstone Shard. Also, it does a good chunk of damage if you hit with it. Now, Glintblade Phalanx and Carrion Phalanx are homing Soulmass 2.0. They're not nearly as damaging as they once were, but still, they're an incredibly powerful deterrent and defensive tool, as well as a good wedge for creating more aggressive openings. It forces rolls for easy Carrion Slicer spam. I don't use Great Blade Phalanx due to the high cost, but it's also an excellent option if you're going for more of a one-shot oriented style. Next we have Star Shower and Stars of Ruin. They're almost completely undodgeable damage. It's a fantastic opener and finisher, or just to be used whenever you aren't being pressured. Stars of Ruin is vastly superior, but there is a case for Star Shower at mid-level for the aforementioned reason. Avoiding this is hard. Next I'll talk about some strong supporting spells that you should keep in your arsenal. The first of these will be Magic Downpour or Founding Rain of Stars. Magic Downpour is kind of not that great, but it fulfills the same role as Founding Rain. Wide area denial. Not only that, but it will angle the shots of magic towards your lock-on target, which is pretty handy. There are actually quite a few area denial options, but these are my choices. Founding Rain of Stars is actually broken strong, it lasts so long, does great damage, is virtually impossible to avoid damage from in the area that it affects. It's your own personal rainstorm. The only downside is that on the rare chance you have a co-invader, they also cannot stand in it. Eternal Darkness is an eloquent solution to a difficult problem, mage gank spam. 25 FP is a reasonable cost to shut down enemy wizards for 10 seconds. By holding the camera down, you can get the orb to float forward instead of up. The only downside is that you have to remain near the orb for it to be effective. But with the time you aren't being pressured, you can set up your own offensive of phalanxes, glintblades, and stars. As for Magic Glintblade, 2 words: asynchronous pressure. Glintblades can be delayed by varying degrees to allow an aggressive approach. It's best to rapid cast them back to back to have a few ready to go, perhaps even locked on to different targets. Carrion Piercer is perhaps the best Carrion sword spell besides Slicer. It has range, a generous hitbox, and has fantastic angular momentum that lets you roll catch while locked on. Not only that, but it will cause a knockdown at full charge. And a knockdown is an excellent opportunity to begin your perfect Okizeme game with all of the spells you have to pressure rolls. Loretta's Greatbow and Loretta's Mastery are long range spells that even have a nice little area of effect when they strike a surface or an enemy. Definitely consider having this one on hand for when the opportunity presents itself. Namely, when you have the opportunity to snipe. There are also other good spells for long-range fighting, but this one's just the one that comes to mind and is probably most reliable. Ambush Shard is not exactly the best sorcery, but it's relatively strong when it hits, and it will hit shield turtles that have no interest in engaging with you. Strongly recommended if you'd like a counter to that. Bear in mind that it does lose pretty hard to both strafing and approaching. Since you have such wonderful area denial options, it might be worth considering to have Terra Magicus on hand. I don't think I would ever use it personally, as you want to be able to remain mobile, and it just doesn't make sense to waste time and FP casting a circle that you'll probably have to evacuate in a moment anyway. But if you have the time and the safety to set it up, go for it. Now on to some more niche picks, or situational options and one-shots. The first and probably best of these will be Cannon of Haima. It's a chargeable explosion and it's definitely useful at mid-level, but outclassed at higher intelligence, and even then it's still strong. It's pretty much impossible to avoid if you're not interrupted, and it has a knockdown property that can push people off ledges. I've done a good 1000 damage with the meteorite staff in this thing. It definitely hurts. Now for Rock Sling. It's not terrible in PvP, but definitely outclassed by other spells once you reach into the higher levels and unlock stronger options that are only available at higher intelligence. But since you'll probably have the meteorite staff until 48 int, you might as well keep a slot for it. The damage is quite good, and it's not a bad choice if you're at range. It's cheap, damaging, and not the easiest thing in the world to dodge consistently. Comma de Zur can have similarly situational uses as it did in Dark Souls 3, especially towards the end of its life cycle. Seeing as how it doesn't initiate a knockdown, however, much of its utility is lost. Still, a free-aimed comet can be an option, though it is easier to avoid than many other choices that are available. Not only this, but it is incredibly slow. I know it's tempting because you can hold it and it does a lot of damage, but I think it's a liability more than it is a virtue. And finally, the moon spells. They're almost entirely useless outside of a long-range snipe, as the tracking is quite good, and it does speed up the longer it's out. But it is so slow, even with Radagon's icon and the Azure staff casting speed boosts. You will absolutely get hit if you are within a stone's throw of your enemy when you begin the casting animation. But if they're running away, you're in the clear. This list is by no means comprehensive. There are plenty of other spells I did not discuss that are incredibly powerful, like the magma sorceries, a few of the other gravity sorceries, the crystal spells, and some of the different glintstone sorceries. Now with that out of the way, let's develop a rudimentary game plan to follow. For starters, you'll probably want to wait to pop your Flask of Wondrous Physic until you can see and engage with the party. If you can see them, but there is no feasible way to engage, they're standing in an open field or otherwise running away from your position, consider waiting for the opportune moment to get the most out of it. Second, consider if you can get a quick kill on a phantom before they notice you. It'll make your job easier in the long run, especially if facing 3 enemies. Also, it may be beneficial to cast your Carrion Phalanx or other asynchronous pressure options prior to the approach, as stamina and time will be of the essence once you've been noticed, and there may not be another good opportunity to do so once you engage. Once you've been thoroughly discovered, which will sometimes be immediately, you'll want to take advantage of the one thing you've got going for you: range. Kiting is the name of the game here, and once you have inevitably failed to do that, a good bit of Carrion Slicer spam will put anyone coming near you on the back foot, so you may begin to kite again. If they're not already dead from Slicer, of course. Options like Star Shower and Stars of Ruin are costly, but supremely effective. Charging these fully will net impressive, often unavoidable amounts of damage. Simple Swift Glintstone Shards and Carrion Glint Blades will pressure nicely, and although easily avoided, Great Glintstone Shards will bait rolls in, so that you can turn on the Carrion Slicer blender. If you see any openings to go for nuke spells, take them. High risk, high reward plays are what you signed up for, and since you're working with a limited resource build, most melee setups simply are not. Unless you've performed adequate stat investment to use some of the more powerful options, once you run out of FP, you are at a severe disadvantage. This is not to say you can't make a play or two with low stat weapons, just that your one advantage of spells is now gone. You may even consider a Flask of Wondrous Physic with FP regeneration to mitigate this, but that can be handled by allocating more cerulean tiers. Don't expect to have much healing for extended engagements either. Kill fast or die faster. Once you have a host alone, if you manage to eliminate their phantoms in the time prior, chasedowns with spells will be somewhat simple, as Swift Glintstone Shard and Carrion Slicer have superb running and jumping attacks. Strafing will still be something of an issue, but strafing means inefficient running, in which case you will catch up to them eventually. And with that, I have imparted most of the knowledge I have to share for sorcerer invasions thus far. It is still fundamentally harder than using a melee build, but now it kind of works, instead of barely at all, like another game I used to play. I can't remember what it was called. Many of these principles apply to the world of incantations, the only real difference being that the effective incantations are a bit more FP efficient. More to come on that. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you would like to add anything or share something I might be wrong about, please comment below. I would love to hear your thoughts or just how you've been doing with invasions in this fresh new landscape. Take care, Bloody Fingers and recusants, and happy casting.